4.5 years ago, 30 people committed to starting a church for the 86% of the people in our community who don't go to church, or as we like to say, a church for people who don't like church. As you can imagine, people were a little bit skeptical. We kept hearing things like, "That's crazy, it'll never work." In 4.5 years, God has done some pretty crazy things. We've seen hundreds of people make first-time decisions to follow Jesus with their lives. We've seen hundreds of people connect in Ridge groups. We've given away hundreds of thousands of dollars to build feeding centers and start new churches and help those in need in our community. And we have been so blessed by God to be known as one of the fastest growing churches in Milwaukee. And not only that, we have a reputation in our community that if you have a friend who doesn't like church and wants to know God, send them over to the Ridge. They'll help him. Well, we really believe that God is calling us to take our next crazy step with Him. In fact, we are calling this series Crazy, Living Beyond Ordinary. But this is much more than a series. This is an opportunity for us to do even more for God, to even have a bigger impact in our community. It's an opportunity for us to see more people find and follow Him. And it's an opportunity for God to stretch our faith in a way that He never would otherwise, because He is calling us to a level of generosity and sacrifice that is truly crazy. So crazy is our way of furthering our mission. Crazy is our bold step of faith, where we're taking our 2-year, $1 million general fund and we are blowing it up to a 2-year, $2.2 million crazy fund. And crazy has 3 components to it. The first component is we are going to do something crazy in our community. Imagine what we could do if we had the advantages of a permanent facility. And that's what we're doing. We're searching for our own permanent facility. And we're looking for a building that doesn't look like a church, but it's a building that will draw people in. And this building isn't just going to be used by us, but it's going to be used by people in our community as well. Well, the second component is we are going to do something crazy to another community. We're going to give even more money away as we expand our ministry in the Dominican and build a feeding center for kids and families in need. You know, this facility will truly save lives. You know, and the final component is we are going to do something crazy for our community. Our mission has always been about our community and for the people that are there. And so what we're going to do is we're going to continue to remain healthy and vibrant as a church as we continue to move forward in crazy. And so we're going to set aside and lock in our general fund the same for those 2 years. You know, our crazy is not a church fundraiser, so to speak. You sure, we're going to talk about radical generosity, and we really believe that God is calling us to do that. But if you think that this is just about money, you're going to miss on what God wants to do in your life over the next couple weeks. You know, crazy is really a spiritual journey. We're going to be challenged by God to hear from Him and then respond to what He wants us to do by taking the biggest step of faith we have ever taken, both as individuals and as a church. In fact, last week, we started on that spiritual journey as we talked about what does it mean to take a step of faith. You know, here's what it really means. It means this. It means we're here and God wants to take us here. And so a step of faith is this gap from where we are to where God wants us to be. And this step of faith is a step that we've never taken before. You know, we talked about last week that faith is defined as trusting in God's promises and then living our life accordingly. It's basically knowing what God wants us to do and taking the step and doing it. It's a new way to live, and it's the way that God has called us to live. Now today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the biggest obstacle that keeps many of us from taking the step of faith. Here's what that obstacle is. Fear. Fear is the biggest obstacle that keeps us from taking a step of faith. The truth is, all of us have fears. Maybe you have a fear of public speaking, or maybe you have a fear of being alone, or a fear of failure and rejection. Maybe you have a fear of getting sick, or a fear of the future, or maybe even a fear of death. Some of the most famous people struggled with fear. Napoleon actually had a fear of cats. Andre Agassi has a fear of spiders. Donald Trump has a fear, the Donald actually has a fear of shaking hands. John Madden has a fear of flying. I have a fear of heights. The thought of being up somewhere high petrifies me. Last summer, we were repainting our shutters, and I had some friends over helping me do it. And when we had to put the shutters back on the second floor, you have to get on an overhang to put the shutters back in. And that overhang is about 12 to 14 feet, not really that high. But I was so scared to get up there that I had my friends do it because they weren't afraid of heights. I mean, it just petrifies me at the thought of going up somewhere high. You know, this may be good news to all of us, but some of the great spiritual giants in the Bible dealt with fear. Moses, Abraham, the disciples, and even Jesus himself all struggled with fear. Fear is such a paralyzing force in our lives that it's not a surprise that the most common command in the Bible is this: fear not. Over and over again, God said, don't be afraid. You see, God knows that the number one obstacle in our lives that keeps us from taking a step of faith is fear. You know, I think most of us know this in some way. I think most of us understand that we have a fear in our life. So you know what we try to do? We try to go around that fear. We think that by going around it, that we'll still get into the place that God wants us to be. So it would look like this. We know that our marriage is struggling, and so we go on pretending that everything is okay. We have an addiction, and we keep telling ourselves that it's not that bad. Someone has wronged us, and we act like it doesn't bother us. We're doing something in our life that we know that God doesn't want us to do, and so we just keep coming up with reasons why it's okay to keep doing it. God wants our finances, and we keep giving him reasons like, I'll get to that later, or what if I can't pay the bills, or I'll work my way into it. You know, we try to work around our fear, but the truth is, it doesn't work because it keeps us right here, and it doesn't take us to the place where God wants us to be. As we talked last week, as we launched our Crazy campaign, God is challenging us to take the biggest step of faith that we have ever taken. I mean, he is challenging us to radical generosity and sacrifice over the next couple of years and to have an even bigger impact on our community. We're here, and God wants us over here. But do you know what the thing is, the big obstacle that is keeping many of us from taking that step? Fear. You're afraid in some way, and so am I. There's a great passage in the Bible that's a great parallel for where we are in the church, as a church. It's found in Joshua chapter 1, and God had just set his people free from slavery with the Egyptians, and then he was going to lead them into the promised land, but his people disobeyed him, and so he kept them in the wilderness. But it was at a time now that God was saying, okay, I'm ready to take you into the promised land. But at that same time, Moses, their leader, had just died, and Joshua was appointed as their new leader. And so God was saying to his people, I'm ready for you to take this big step of faith with me. I want you to go from the wilderness to the promised land. It's yours, but you have to be willing to take the step. Now, as you can imagine, the people were afraid. Joshua, their leader, he was afraid because they knew that taking this step meant going to battle against countries, and some of these countries were bigger than them, they were more sophisticated than they were, and they knew that by taking this step, it meant loss, it meant risk, and it meant leaving the familiar and the comfortable, even though it meant leaving just a wilderness. And so you know what the people tried to do? They tried to go around it. They kept saying, let's stay here, let's stay here. Listen to what God says to Joshua. He says this, as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give them. Be strong and courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Now I want you to notice something in that passage. 3 times God repeats this phrase to Joshua. He says, be strong and courageous. And even one of those times he says, be strong and very courageous. Now why would God say that? Because God knew that they were afraid, and he knew that that fear would keep them in the wilderness. You know, here's the danger of giving into our fear. The danger is we will miss out on all God has for us. You see, our fear keeps us over here, but we need to know this. Being in God's place is always better than being where we are. You know, for them, it meant staying in the wilderness instead of, or versus, being over here in the promised land. And this was a place that had everything that they could ever imagine. You know, for us, being over here might mean settling. It might mean settling for a loveless marriage. It might be settling for a dead-end job, a wounded heart, empty religion, versus experiencing all God has for us right here. You see, being in the place that God wants us to be is always better than being where we are. You know what's great is that God gives us another way. He gives us another way besides going around it. And he says to Joshua, and he says to the people, he says, have courage, go through it. You see, God's way is not to remove the fear or pretend like it's not there. God's way is to go through it, and that takes courage. Now, my guess would be is that we have all experienced this in some way. I mean, we've all had this time where we were afraid to do something on the front end, and then we went through our fear, and now we're so glad that we did. You know, maybe for you, it's when you first met your wife and you asked her out. Or it's when you first had kids, or when you bought your first house, or maybe for some of you, it's when you stepped foot in church. Maybe you were stepping foot back in church, or you're stepping foot in church for the very first time. We've all had that experience where we were afraid, and then we went through it, and now we're so glad that we did. Let me ask you this. What is it that you're afraid of right now? What is that fear that you're not willing to have the courage and go through it? You know, this is why we need to do this crazy campaign. We need to move past some of our fears that we have about trusting God with our money and our church. You know, many of us have fears as we go through this process. You know, one of our fears is, what if I sacrificially give to this campaign and we don't reach our $2.2 million goal? You know, I really believe that if every individual and every family surrenders to God and they ask God, what step of faith do you want me to take to give, to be a part of this crazy campaign? And then they have the courage to work through those fears and take that step of faith. I believe that we'll have exactly what God wants us to have. And if it's less, it's less. And we'll move forward with what God gives us. And if it's more, it's more. You know, here's another fear. Here's a common question I've been asking, and it's this. Mark, are you staying? I mean, I want to give to this. I want to be a part of this. But, you know, are you going to leave during it or shortly after? Here's what you need to know. We feel very called to this community and to this church. We love being here. I mean, this is like my dream job, personally speaking. And we really believe that we have just scratched the surface of what God wants to do in this community. You know, I look at it this way. You'll probably have to kick us out before we leave. Another big fear that people have is, what about the economy? I mean, we are bombarded with news on a daily basis about the stock market and gas prices and unrest in the Middle East and Japan and even in our own state. I mean, you can't help but be a little afraid of the future. But who can predict the future anyways? You know, who would have predicted that just in a few years after Brett Favre left, that Aaron Rodgers would lead the Packers to a Super Bowl? I hate saying that, by the way. You know, who would have predicted that interest rates would be this low? You know, who would have predicted for some of you that you'd be in church right now following God? And who would have predicted that Charlie Sheen would go off the deep end and just crack? Okay, I don't want to sound prideful, but I actually predicted that one. You know, but here's the point. Only God knows the future. And that's why it's so important and it's so critical that we follow His leading rather than follow the leading of those voices of fear that constantly go through our mind. I love what author Corrie ten Boom said. She said this: never be afraid to trust your unknown future to a known God. You know, the truth is, we don't know the future, but we can trust God and take a step of faith right now, knowing that He'll take care of our unknown future. You know, another question is, will this change me? Yeah, it will. Another question that many people have are, will it change the Ridge? You know what? Yes, it will. And it's going to change it in a good way. We are going to be able to do things that we have never done before. And we're going to be able to do things, but do them even better. I mean, we're going to be able to do kids and students and weekend services. We're going to be able to train our leaders and ministry teams in a way that we have never been able to do before. And because we do this and have the resources and facility to do it, we will be able to make a much bigger impact than we ever thought possible. You know, here's what I know about all of us. We all want to be over here. We all want to be in that place that God wants us to be, because this is the place where marriages are healed. This is the place where kids and students find Jesus. This is the place where single people make commitments to do things God's way. This is the place where our community gets served in ways that it never would otherwise. This is the place where our finances are blessed. This is the place where our faith is deepened. And this is the place where we get those God stories. You know, those type of stories that we all want to tell where God just showed up in our life. And the reason why those stories are there is because over here, God is able to do things in our life that we could never do, or that He could never do over here. We all want to be right here. I said that I have a fear of heights. Psychologists say we are born with two innate fears: fear of falling and fear of loud noises. This means that every other fear we have is learned, which means it can be unlearned. And the only way to unlearn them is do what God says. Have courage and go through it. I've always done things to go around my fear of heights. I feel like if I'm going to talk about having courage and going through a fear, that I need to go through a fear that I have, and that is my fear of heights. So I schedule an appointment. I get to the place and I check in, where I'm told I'll have to wait up to 2 hours. That 2 hours seem to last forever. You're waiting and you're wondering if this thing is really going to happen. Finally, my name is called and I go to this room where I put on a jumpsuit, get instructions, and we walk out to the plane. And this plane is a tiny plane. I mean, really tiny. And it comes and picks us up, and we take off. As the plane leaves the runway, this fear just wells up inside of me, and everything in me wants to go around it. I want to yell, but I can't. I want to turn around, but it's too late. But I pray for God to give me the courage to go through it and not let my fear control me. We get to 10,000 feet, which means it's time to jump. And I'm a mess inside. I want to run, but I have no place to go. I'm doing what is called a tandem jump, which means I will be jumping hooked onto someone else. The door of the plane opens up. I slide over to the ledge, put 1 foot on the wing, and I keep 1 foot inside the plane with 10,000 feet below me. I'm ready to jump, but I'm so afraid that I hesitate, and so I just sit there. And as I'm sitting there, my partner realizes it, and he says this to me, "Don't worry, nothing can separate us. You jump, and I'll be right there with you." His words actually gave me some assurance. So I jumped, and there we were, free falling at about 150 miles an hour, and my fear just goes away. And oddly enough, there I was falling, and I actually felt safe. Finally, I figured out why. It was because it wasn't just me jumping. I had someone else with me, and that made all the difference. I want to challenge all of you to do 2 things this week. The first challenge is I want to challenge all of you to face a fear that you have and do what God says. Have courage, go through it. I don't mean go and jump out of an airplane or anything like that, but for some of you, your marriage is struggling and you're just pretending like everything is okay. You're afraid if you say something, your spouse will either leave you or not be responsive. Have courage, go through it. For others of you, that means face up to an addiction that you have. You've been afraid in the past to confess your addiction because you're afraid you may lose someone close to you, or the intense personal pain and cost it'll be to work through that addiction. Have courage, go through it. For some of you, you're in a destructive relationship right now, and you're afraid that if you end that relationship or make a different choice, that you're going to end up all alone, or people are going to laugh at you for the decision that you make. Have courage, go through it. Here's the second challenge I have for you. I want to challenge all of you to face a fear you have as we go through this crazy journey. Have courage, go through it. When it comes to trusting God and money, this kind of brings up all sorts of fears that we have, and we often just want to shut down and then just go around it and not deal with it at all. Have courage and go through it. Take the step of faith and see how God blesses you because of the step you take. For some of you, that may mean that you give for the very first time. You've been coming for a while, but you haven't gave because there's all sorts of fears attached to you giving money to a church. Maybe for this crazy campaign, the way you have courage and go through your fear is by giving and being a part of the crazy campaign. For others of you, this may mean you start to tithe. A tithe means 10%. It's the number that God asks us to bring back to Him in a way of acknowledging that He is in charge of our finances. And you're afraid that if you tithe that you're not going to be able to pay the bills, or that God won't do what He says He's going to do. Have courage, go through it, see what God does. For others of you, it may mean you sell an investment to make an investment. You have a fear of the future, and you're afraid that you're not going to have enough, and so you're constantly storing up more and more and more because you think that's going to give you security. So what you need to do to face your fear is you need to take part of that investment and make that investment in eternity. And so I want to encourage you, have courage, go through it, sell an investment to make an investment, and see how God blesses you. Here's what I'm asking you to do. I'm asking you to lay it all on the table before God and pray this. God, what step of faith would you have me take to be a part of this crazy campaign? And as you pray that, there's going to be some fears that come up. And you're going to be tempted to go around those fears. When those fears come up, do what God says. Have courage, go through it. It's only when we take that step and have courage and go through it that we realize that as we're walking, we're not alone. He is right there with us the whole time. He's just waiting for us to jump.